Thank you. Hi, good morning or afternoon. It's just turned midday. Thanks very much for joining us. So we're here today to talk about different ways that news organisations can relearn to listen to their audiences, or as I like to call them, communities. So my name is Catherine Giles. I'm the director of the Engaged Journalism Accelerator, which is run by the European Journalism Centre. It's a big mouthful. So I won't go into detail too much about what engaged journalism is, but I'll be here at the end so you can talk to me more about our program. But basically, our program is grant funding 12 news organisations from across Europe who are practising engaged journalism, so really doing an approach to their journalism that is truly community-driven. So the program consists of grant funding. We are also running events. We're producing resources. We have community calls, so there's lots of different ways that other news organisations or journalists from anywhere can get involved. So just a couple of things that we've got coming up that might be of interest. If you go on to engagedjournalism.com, we have a next community call coming up on the 25th of April, and each month we have these community calls that are themed, and it's at 4 p.m. Central European summertime. So go and check that out. And then also we have an event coming up in Berlin in June, on the 19th of June, which is a big sort of flagship event of ours. Registrations opened yesterday, so if you go onto our website, you can find out more about that as well. But just a bit of context then about sort of why we're holding this panel and why I've brought my panel members here is that, you know, obviously there's huge issues, especially in Europe, I would say, but other places in the world, in terms of lack of trust in news organisations and in the news. And we're constantly trying to look at how we can, you know, overcome some of those barriers. And what we're starting to find through the news organisations that we're working with, so not just the grantees, but also lots of other organisations who are in our network, is around, you know, there's a real value in face-to-face events. So it's not just about engaging with people online through comments, but the value of face-to-face events in dedicated spaces, the value of not parachuting into communities. You know, instead of just going and doing a story and then leaving that community, it's how you can continue to engage with those people. And also, you know, continually showing up in terms of building that rapport and the trust with the people who are, in effect, using your service or reading your content. So I'll hand on to my panel members who can introduce themselves and give you a little bit of context as to why they're here and how that fits in with the topic today. Paul.
Hello. Yep, that's working. So, yeah, my name's Paul Miles, and I work for a small organisation in London called On Our Radar, and we're actually one of the grantees of the Engaged Journalism Accelerator. And our work is all about, we're not a publisher, we publish stories in collaboration with mainstream media outlets. And our work is all centred around how we can get communities who are typically excluded from the media, some of the most marginalised communities, more closely involved in the storytelling process to lead their own stories in a more participatory way. And I was really glad actually that the way the panel was framed was to talk about listening, because I actually think really that's at the centre of what we do, and I think that some journalists with the time constraints and rush have kind of forgotten about this, you know, this basic art of listening. So how do we do that? How do we manage to get stories from marginalised and excluded communities? The truth is it's not always easy, and the listening actually is at the very start of this process. In that, in every project that we work with, we want to co-design the project, and we want to co-design a tool of engagement, to use the tools and to use the platforms, or to use an approach that those people would feel most comfortable with. So I'll just take a few minutes to give you a few examples of some of the different approaches and the many challenges of which we can come on to, and happy to talk to you about after this panel. So what we've found in working with the different communities that we've worked with is there are 4 C's that we regularly find that would block someone's participation from sharing their story in the media. And so these 4 C's that we're often working to try and overcome, firstly, our confidence. So I think there's a lot of talk about engagement that's happening at conferences like this, and it talks about, you know, how they can kind of engage their readers to feed into some of their stories and things. But I think one of the risks we're running is that if we focus just on, you know, those readers or audiences that are going to actively participate, then we risk kind of excluding those who are already excluded, and we risk just working with those who are most confident already that they will be able to shape the narrative and influence the way a media outlet tells a story. The second C that we work on is capacity, so offering training to citizen reporters and communities to give them the skills they need to share their story safely and securely. The third C that we work on as well is connectivity. So we did a panel yesterday about why, for example, mobile reporting is an important part of our work, because we work in Sierra Leone a lot, for example, where only 13% of people have regular access to a smartphone and to internet. So we've built an SMS, an audio platform, which allows them to share stories in a very personal way, just using their basic mobile phone. Or we've worked with people with dementia and Alzheimer's in the UK who would obviously have difficulties, some of them, in accessing online platforms and online tools. So creating tech systems which make them very comfortable to share their story. And the last C, sometimes I go with 3 C's, today I'm going to go with 4 C's. The last C is about conviction. So also in the framing of this panel was interesting to see about, you know, there's a lack of trust in the media, and when you're working with communities, especially communities on the margins, it's not surprising to see actually that many of them are frightened to sort of share their story or their opinion, you know, because they're scared of the risk of it being sensationalized or twisted or not actually shaped in the way that they would like to shape their story. So this conviction, and which links back to this listening, that sharing their story is valuable, sharing their story is important, and they are indeed experts in their own lived experience. So I'll hand over for now so I don't talk, and then I'd be happy to talk in the discussion afterwards about some examples of projects that we've worked on both in the UK and abroad, and would also be really happy to hear from other journalists or media outlets in the room to discuss how we may be able to use some of these approaches and collaborate on community-led storytelling projects. So thank you.
Yeah, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Abhay. 8 years ago, I was really irritated by the way social media was being used in a purely operational way. It was very frustrating, and that's when I started this program called Digital Identities. The goal of this program was, and still is, to get people to invest time in discovery for 2 things. One is new forms of participation, because audience engagement can be a much abused word, which means the same old. And the other one, which is closely tied to audience engagement now, is also new models of sustainable social impact. When it comes to relearning to listen, so what I've written down here is, of course, it's about asking a question, but very often what I see that doesn't happen is when you ask a question, you don't sort of absorb the knowledge that you're getting back into your process. So I would say, if you were to relearn how to listen, yes, let's ask those questions, keep asking them, but can we actually put them back in our process, first of all? And if we think we're already doing so, can we open up our process even more? So there's genuine points of input for our audiences to take part in our programs and projects. And then finally, when it comes to building trust, can we communicate what has happened back to everyone who's taken part? Because that's also something I feel that's missing in this sort of feedback loop. Now, I feel that I will say this sounds nice on paper, but it is very complex. This needs to be structured and discovered, because there's no one-size-fits-all approach. I work with governments, media, and the cultural sector because I think we're all doing the same thing, and I think these models need to be sort of cross-pollinated. And I'm sort of convinced that we need to invest time in choosing an approach that works for the mindset, our team, and also the nature of our newsroom. So in this scheme, something like classic crowdsourcing is a terrible idea, because what you're really doing is you're setting yourself up to receive a lot of white noise, which is demoralizing because you have to sift through a lot of information that is not relevant to you. So structuring really means go ask those questions, but I think it's okay to give people boundaries and choices. And that's how you start an interesting, nuanced discussion or debate. And when you start thinking about what are the boundaries I can set so the discussion continues to be open, that's when I feel, and I think you made this point yesterday, I saw it on Twitter, that's when you start understanding what bits of my process I can let go of, but I can still maintain editorial integrity. I'll just give two short examples before we move on to make this a bit more real. There are two kinds of values that we're also trying to create. One is intangible values. So Catherine was also involved in a project of ours where we were working with a newsroom in Sweden, and they wanted to create empathy at the height of the refugee crisis. And we used a game-based narrative, and they achieved that. They had about 400 people taking part in co-producing a story about refugees, and that created a lot of awareness. And there's also tangible values, but I think that's the easiest bit. You can gamify stuff in any way. You can go and get your 100 million hits. But I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the end result of that? And I think we need to focus on the intangible values that we are creating as well. Thank you.
Okay. Is that on? Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along. I'm Jackie Park. I'm a researcher at the moment with the Centre for Media Transition at the University of Technology in Sydney, and I'm also working as a consultant with media companies and startups in the Asia Pacific region. There's one project I'm working on at the moment which is in its early stages, but it's a deep listening project with a media company in Australia, which is really interested in, it's an advertising-driven model, and they opened their doors to donations about a year ago and found that they had a really committed audience. So their journalism was obviously hitting the mark, but they want to now sort of understand how could they build a more engaged, loyal kind of relationship with this group, and then, of course, look at other ways to diversify their revenue. As part of my work as a researcher, I'm wrapping up a project that has taken me through Australia and New Zealand and also into Asia, where I've spoken to about 50 media startups and innovators in the big media companies. And the reason for doing it is it's really about mapping innovation, primarily in Australia and New Zealand, but looking at outliers in the Asia-Pacific region, to understand right now, how do people see the challenges? How do they face them? What kind of things are they doing? What's working? What's not working? And what we're trying to do is to obviously gather that kind of data and then push it back out so it helps guide the industry through change. What I see, I guess the most important thing that I see is that I think there is a deep understanding now amongst most media companies that to be successful, you really do have to have an ear to your audience. Now, they're doing that in many different ways, and I'll get to some examples, I think, as we go through. But I think so the thread that I guess runs through my work is it's really about sort of understanding what's happening and then taking that back out and advising and working with media startups and media companies. But the key point is, over the last few years, I think we all know that there's been a pretty big pivot to the reader. So most media companies were still reliant on advertising a few years ago, and I wouldn't say necessarily comfortable with that, but it meant it was a different model. You were trying to kind of gather an audience that you would then on-sell to advertisers. as we've had to rethink that model and pivot more to readers, it's an absolutely fundamental change in the way that media organisations need to structure themselves and need to understand their audience and, you know, make sure that they're actually delivering on that. So, yeah, so that it fundamentally changes that challenge. So I think going from that business to business model to a B2C, a business to consumer or business to audience, has much broader implications than I think some media organisations do understand. And so it means that you really need to be focused on your audience rather than the advertiser. And so how do you do that? That's, I think, where this kind of deep listening comes in. And my work is, you know, I would say it's very much we need to be focused now on solving the problem for our audience. And that means we need to understand their need. And my work is very much influenced by human-centred design, and I think some of you were in a workshop I did yesterday. And so there's different ways that you can employ that kind of methodology to kind of do a deep listening of your audience to make sure that we're actually understanding what it is their need, because I think too much, you know, journalism has always been, as journalists, and I'm a journalist, like we know the story, like, you know, we will deliver. But I think also people's fundamental needs have changed because they can get different kinds of news from a whole range of different places now that makes journalism in some areas redundant, but actually makes it so much needed in other areas. And I think that's what we need to understand, is what really is the need of the audience and what might delight them. What can we do? So,
great,
yeah.
Thanks. And continuing then on from that, where you're talking about, you know, the types of things that news organisations need to be doing in order to affect this change. So part of that might be around human-centric design. I guess a first question then to ask of the three of you is what sort of new skills or new resources, so human resources or other, do news organisations need in order to facilitate this sort of shift? And on the back of that, it's around, you know, this whole cultural change within news organisations that have to happen, not just, oh, it's one person's job to be the listener in the organisation or you know, the community engagement person, but what types of skills and sort of other things do you think news organisations could be starting to bring on board or think about?
For us on our radar, I think the key to being able to, the key to our approach really has been the collaboration between journalistic skills, this kind of design thinking, and technologists, because then by combining those skills it allows us to work out where the community feels most comfortable and how to design, you know, a project and a storytelling process that will best suit that community. So to give a couple of brief examples, I mentioned a big project we did in the UK with people with dementia and Alzheimer's. We realised their kind of the difficulties they may have sharing their story, that some may feel intimidated or marginalised by certain technologies, and we realised, as well as the connectivity barrier, that the confidence barrier may be a big thing for this group. So we designed some 3D printed phones which were as simple as possible to use. They just have one button on it that says report. And we realized that that generation is quite familiar with leaving voicemails. So when they press that button, it goes straight through to a voicemail line saying, "This is Dementia Diaries, please leave your report, leave your diary after the beep." And by then mentoring the people that we were working with over a period of time, we got a couple of thousand audio diaries from people with dementia, which really documented the day-to-day life of living with the condition. I mentioned also we worked with community reporters in Sierra Leone throughout the Ebola crisis. And again, we recognized that literacy levels were fairly low in Sierra Leone, but people's oral storytelling capabilities are absolutely amazing. And that if we wanted to really reach the more rural, remote promote affected kind of settings, then to build a platform that would allow them to share their stories via SMS and via voice was really crucial to getting these kind of very raw, authentic, and in the moment kind of reports. But we've also done place-based kind of things, gathering people in the UK around electric firesides and a cup of tea to talk about social cohesion and what holds their communities together. And we also work on documentaries. So sometimes when it's a personal story or the story of a small group, we don't necessarily need a tech platform. So what underpins all of these things, though, which isn't actually a new job title necessarily or a new role, is, and it relates to this listening, is that with all of these projects, and I think this comes with sort of this need to kind of seed some of our powers as journalists, with all of these projects, we go in with the same questions, which is, so you're the experts in your experience of living through Ebola, of living with dementia, of living in this town in the UK. What should we be reporting on? What is missing in the media? What really pisses you off about the way the media talk about this issue? And obviously we do our research before, so we know the trends and the basic facts, but I think for some journalists it's frightening to go into a story with such open questions and saying, well, you're the community, you guys are the experts, please guide us. What's very important with that is learning how to capture that, reflect that back to the group to make sure it's accurately understood. And as we were talking about just now, make sure that this feedback and that those stories are actually reflected in the final output in a way they're happy with.
Yeah.
So I think we should be moving beyond, and I think we already are thinking about digital in the sense of digital first. Wherever I've seen digital first happen, I've seen people being trained like monkeys to use digital platforms, so everyone is then invested in the process of using the technology. I think we need to develop contextual digital literacies, which is giving people who have the tacit knowledge of delivering a sense of agency that I can choose to accept or reject a certain kind of technology because frankly it's not working for me. Secondly, with contextual digital literacy, I think we can port some of the methodologies that are being used into our own practice. So game-based narratives are growing. You talk about behavior and needs. I'm not talking about gamification, I'm talking about game-based narratives where you solve increasingly critical problems. And we've used game-based narratives in two scenarios working with journalists. One was in Sweden again at the height of the refugee crisis, and then the other one was in Bombay when there was a protest march by the right wing to protest positive discrimination policies for the minority groups. And it was fantastic. When they got a sense of what a game-based narrative is, then they were able to introduce all of their complex, nuanced, data-driven stories, but at a scale that people could understand and relate to. And that is what had an impact on the quality of conversations, and of course, it brought clicks to their website. So I would say contextual digital literacies is an urgent need.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a huge culture change in a newsroom, and it involves taking a step back so that you are not, just working on the story, but you're actually asking yourselves or asking the newsroom, who is our audience? So and maybe opening that up. So there's, I've been watching KPCC. I don't know if any of you have been watching what they've been doing out of LA, the NPR station. So on early childhood education, for example, they said, well, what if we said, who's our audience? Like, it's not just those that listen to KPCC or read, but actually our audience were mothers and fathers or carers of children aged 0 to 5. Then if you actually broaden that out, it then gives you some indicators of where you go to find that audience. And I think at that step you need to be completely open to the kind of methods that you would use to find that audience and to listen to them. So in their case they ended up using community events, going out to childhood centres, child libraries, but also using postcards. So they mailed out, I think, 6,000 postcards to try to reach new audiences, and that was quite successful. But there are many other ways that you can do that. So phone-ins, for example, just opening up your crowdsourcing, you know, the information that you're trying to get. There's another group in India called Pickle Jar that is currently on the road listening to their audience throughout the state of Karnataka, so at election time. And they're sort of doing that deep listening, and of course that's giving them stories that they're then telling. So I think it's a huge cultural shift, and it's about not being afraid to just take a step back and say what is needed here. Who is the audience? What is their need? How can we understand what they need? And then figuring out what is the best way to do that, and being open really to any kind of ideas that might come up. There's also sort of other ways of listening, and one I've seen that I really like is news picks out of Japan. They've recently bought Quartz, and they're planning on building that model through the US as well. But they built it initially, it's about 4 years old. They built it as a tech platform, and it's around business and technology, and it was really a curated site, but allowed commenting. But so people who were able to comment once only, you can't tag people, you can't, so you can't then reply to people, so there's no sort of trolling and argumenting. But what they then did is they then layered on top of that their own journalism, and they work with experts. So they spent the time, the first year in building this platform, they actually went out and they found a whole lot of experts in the area who were prepared to come on and comment on each story. So they actually planned their journalism with the audience in mind. So each week they plan out what stories they're going to do. So if they're going to do, say, a story on the algorithms of Uber and Didi, comparing those, for example, then they will reach out to people in the space, provide the story, and allow that commenting. Now that's quite a huge cultural shift for journalists, because it's often correcting their journalism. It's certainly deepening their journalism. And so I think that being open as well as a journalist to saying, you know, of course we're not the experts on it. You know, we're sort of daily experts on a whole range of different topics, but actually really accepting that and accepting kind of corrections and questioning of your journalism is one shift.
Great.
Can I respond to,
Yeah.
I think you make a really interesting point in who is our audience, but I just want to add a little bit of nuance that works for us as we say who else could be our audience, because then, because when you say who is our audience, there's no boundaries. People always go back to the same old. When we say who else could be our audience, I found people are a little bit more playful. And when you are a little bit more playful, you can be a little bit more outrageous. And then what we tend to do with them, you say, okay, if they are completely unattainable, who is the bridge between you and that exotic audience? And it's in finding the bridge that becomes an interesting discovery exercise. I'll give you a quick example from a museum. I always talk about it, it's my favorite one. So Nordiska Museet, it's the Swedish museum. Their website was being used by a small right-wing group to say this is what Swedish culture looks like. And they were also trying to reach out to younger people, who is our audience. So we said, who else can take your offer and present it to these younger people who don't care about you and don't want to be patronized? So in that discovery exercise, they found that the shared value between a curator of natural history, supernatural histories, who has a PhD, many PhDs, is the cosplay community. These are grown-ups who dress up like superheroes, because the shared value was they're both equally obsessed about cultural history and craft. And they took their message out. That led to a 60% increase in young people accessing their website. And this all started by us sort of nudging them along to say, be playful. You have a very serious job. Absolutely, no one's doubting that, and you have the expertise. But let's be playful and say, who else could there be in our bubble?
Great. And at this stage, I'm going to sort of put something to the audience, and I meant to say at the start, please do put your hands up at any stage if you want to comment or contribute or ask a question to any of the panel members. You don't feel the need to leave it at the end. So I guess a prompt to people in the audience, and there's familiar faces from news organisations who are doing a really good job of like listening in different ways. But has anyone got anything that they would want to share with each other and the panel members about things that you're doing within your news organisations where you've changed internal culture, or you've taken on different skill sets or resources to try and address some of the things that you're doing around engaging differently with your community or your audience. I don't know if we've got a roaming microphone that we need. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Miles Smith from Internews. We're a US and UK-based organization, and we started a group called the Listening Post. If anybody is interested, it's actually a bunch of open source tools for doing engaged journalism in your own newsroom. So if you want to kind of flip the culture a little bit, there's a bunch of great resources for that. It's called the Listening Post Playbook. I can give you a couple of examples of things that some of our partners have done. For instance, actually a lot of this stuff is similar to On the Radar. In New Orleans, we had a local public radio partner that was not listening at all to the African American community in some of the distressed parts of the city, and what we did with them was install actual physical listening devices in places where people congregated, like barbershops or church foyers, where people could just make a comment. We would put a physical prompt of a question we were interested in hearing them answer, and they could basically record a message on the spot about a conversation that they were having, or drop a tip to the newsroom that way. And it led to a real change in how that neighborhood was covered, from one of like just parachuting in and covering crime to something much more interesting. So again, if you're interested in that, it's all free at the Listening Post Collective. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And this lady in the front here.
Hi, this sort of talks to your point a little bit. I work for HuffPost in the UK, and we did a project last year in the summertime. We took our whole newsroom to Birmingham, which is kind of Britain's second city, but it's incredibly undercovered. Everything is very London-based. So we got an old shop, just a shop that nobody was using in the shopping centre. We moved our whole newsroom there, all our reporters, everything. And we just did our journalism from there for a week, and we had listening posts kind of in that same way around the city, where we asked people to talk to us about what issues they wanted us to report on, as well as responding to our reporting. And one of the things that was interesting for me is I'm a features editor, I'm not a news editor, and we did also, it wasn't just that we found great news stories, which we absolutely did, but for instance we found all these incredible stories about kindness in Birmingham that kind of were very uplifting and very different from what you might have expected to find. So they were unusual and have really changed our journalism. And I think our reporters and writers got an incredible amount from it. You know, we talked a lot to them about active listening and kind of how they were kind of like, what do we do if someone just comes in and wants to give us a story? Because actually our newsrooms don't normally work like that people just drop in off the street with a tip for you. So it was a really great experience, and I hope it's one we can repeat. It was really positive, I think, for the whole newsroom.
Yeah, I was following that. It was brilliant, last year. Yeah.
And so can I just ask, so has that shifted the kind of journalism, like you say, you were telling a lot of good news stories or uplifting stories. Has that changed the way that you think about, is that the kind of journalism that you found that your audience responded to?
We do find that actually it's interesting. We'd started reporting quite a bit about kindness because one of my writers, one of my feature writers, my life writers, she said to me, I'd like to do 30 days of kindness to start the new year at the beginning of 2018. I thought, okay, well, let's have a go with it. And we did find there is really good audience for that, and Birmingham kind of helped us really double down on that. So, yeah, that's a pretty core part of certainly our life journalism now is kindness, right? Who would think?
Great. We've got a question there and then one at the back as well. We'll take this first.
Hi, this is a question. I'm a freelance journalist. My name is Alessio, and I've got a question for Paul. So you were talking about going to a community and saying, you guys are the experts, please guide us in your experience, what's happening to your town. Can you tell us a bit about the challenges to that? I've as a freelance journalist, I've been to marginalised communities and have invariably asked, what do you think, what is going on, what do you think I should report on? And there's been this case in a town that's that ended up voting for the far-right populist party here in Italy, where there was literally no migration, no crime, but they would invariably say, immigration, security, those are the issues that you should cover. So can you tell us a bit about the challenges of the approach and how you navigate them?
Yeah, sure. So I think the challenges are quite different, with each community that we work with, and I think that what's important is that we're interested in hearing the voices of lesser heard communities. So I think this approach works when you're kind of it wouldn't obviously work when you're trying to challenge people in power or challenge those narratives. It works when trying to kind of coax out stories with less heard communities. I think that the challenge is in managing expectations and in sort of being very clear about what the project is and what the story is and how it's going to work, and managing expectations about how many inputs can be included in the final product and how you're going to work that, and that's very important. The challenge also is in making sure that you listen and that you reflect back and that you have some kind of agreement as to, okay, this is what we've heard, this is what we're talking about, this is what we feel like the kind of main stories are, and kind of iteratively working with the community to check that kind of actually reflects what they were going to say. A story not going out, or a story with the wrong narrative, which kind of isn't what they wanted to share, or a story that we do nothing with, can be more disempowering and more frustrating and make people more angry at the media than the benefit that it would create. So I think you have to be very careful about that. The other thing that we found quite clearly is, in terms of the trust, is just by starting up with that relationship and by saying we are, we're equal collaborators in this project. You're not just sources, but you're experts. It really opens up this kind of sense of trust. And then actually I've often been surprised by the collaboration comes in the fact that they're experts in their own lived experience. And we, as journalists, bring with us production skills, video making skills, and the legal and ethical knowledge of how to pitch and package content to an editorially high standard. And often when we've gone back then communities to say, okay, you shared this with us, like this is your report, like we're gonna put it out here on The Guardian, or we're gonna put it out, what do you think? They actually, they're often their reaction is just like, yeah, of course, go for it. That's why I shared the report. And I think when that happens, it shows that you've actually, in terms of it being a true collaboration, is that you've built that trust that they've done their bit and shared their lived experience, and they're saying like, yeah, we now trust you to go away and do your bit and pitch it and package it up and make it look nice. Briefly responding to your point about this community, I think it can be a challenging point. I think if that's the views of that community, then often, in Britain we have many of the same issues, and we see it with Brexit at the moment, and let's not go into that. But the actual frustrations of these communities and what they're really annoyed about is very important to hear. And actually, if we are trying to give away some power, and if we are trying to play a role that facilitates people and amplifies their voices, then it's important to hear views that are also going to challenge us, and that that we have to work with. Wrapping up on that, I think there's a line. We'll have policies around the types of storytelling we were doing. So we worked with a community in Nigeria to do an election reporting project covering the elections from their communities. And, we got a couple of sort of quite homophobic kind of opinions shared in the WhatsApp group. And we were able to say that's quite clearly a sort of a violation of our policy. We want our approach is about being open and inclusive and hearing all voices, and that type of speech that may exclude other people in this group. So therefore it doesn't sit with us. So I think sort of some clarity and some boundaries helps with that too.
And communicate your expectations. I think that's what you're saying. We're doing I'm going to bring a non-newsroom example again, but again, we're doing a project in Amiens in France with cultural curators, and there's artwork that keeps being vandalized in the city. And what was happening was, like yourself, with the best of intentions, they were saying, let's go and talk about this. But we're making a shift saying, we are offering something to you, and we'll do it as a level playing field, but we also would like something back from you. So I wonder if you do communicate your expectations when you go into a community.
Yeah, and I think that's I know that we have a question up here as well, but there's a point there about transparency, and we could have a whole separate session on just transparency and accountability and how those are intrinsically linked. But even an example on the back of that of one of the grantee organisations we're working with from Belgium called Medor, and they do investigations, and they're sort of doing this road trip towards the end of this year where they're literally taking themselves out to different communities physically to do lots of collaboration and everything. And with some of their investigations, they were sort of saying that they're very open in terms of their processes, so they don't go into an investigation thinking or setting an expectation that this will be the result of the investigation. I guess like you do a bit of research, you don't actually know what the end result is going to be, but they will always say, we're going to look at this investigation because we think there's something there, or there's something interesting, or our community has told us that this is a challenge, but actually it might not lead anywhere, and it might be really inconclusive, and we might get halfway through it and have to bin it because it just hasn't, there's not been any result, or it hasn't been something that needed investigating after all, sort of thing. But but they're very clear to say that as long as they have said that to their communities from the outset, then it's not like they're going to get angry people knocking on the door, sort of holding them to accountability. So, yeah. Let's take, we've got a question at the back, and then I'll come to this lady here.
My name is Mattia. Hi, I'm from Italy. I work in digital marketing. There were two topics that were touched that I was curious to know more about. One is the game-based narrative that I heard quoted, but I don't know what it is. And the other one is media shifting from B2B to B2C. If you could make some examples of some very nice cases that you saw that touched you, and you can share with the audience. Thank you.
I guess do we want to go to Abe first to do with and then on to Jackie? Yeah.
I can introduce sort of the basic logic of a game-based narrative, and then usually when I try and explain the example, it becomes way too convoluted. So I'll start with the logic. So any game players here? Anyone plays computer games at the audience? Show of hands.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, feel free to jump in as well. So very basically, like a story, a game has a beginning, middle, and end, right? And you make your way from the beginning to the end by solving challenges. The most important bit of a game is the beginning, because that's where I'm giving you the tools to start solving problems. And I'm sort of easing you into this environment. So later on, when I throw complex challenges at you, at least you know how to use your tools in a variety of ways. And the end of the game-based narrative then is that it should be rewarding for you. That's different from gamification, which is I will get you to perform a series of repetitive tasks, like playing the whole farm thing on social media, and the only beneficiary will be me, because I've got access to your time and attention, but there's literally no meaningful reward for you. Does that answer some of your questions? Should I try and turn that into an example, or?
You can. I'm just going to say at this point as well, we have about 10 minutes to go.
I'll pass on to you. The example will take too much time.
Okay, so the B2B to B2C, I mean, that's a really fundamental shift. So B2B is business to business, so it was media organisations serving advertisers. So that was around creating an audience that you could then on-sell. But there's much less care who that audience is. It's really just about eyeballs or clicks or things like that. So for quite a few years, I think, when media moved online, most media were really interested in reach, like just really getting, a big reach without actually really thinking deeply about who that audience might be and what their needs might be. So with the decline of advertising, there's been a shift to the audience, which means it's now, the business model is much more business to consumer or business to audience. And so that plays out in different ways. Some of the major media companies that have now put up paywalls, for example, so they care much more now about having a very, what they call a loyal and engaged relationship with their readers. And so they're thinking about that in a lot of different ways. From a business perspective, you know, how do you get people, like at the top of the funnel, interested, and then bring them down, you know, get them more and more engaged to the point that they actually subscribe, and then how do you keep them? So people are thinking about what are the loyalty triggers? So what is it that would make somebody actually stay? And it might be, you know, signing up to newsletters, for example, or it might be, you know, going to events. So people are putting in different kind of models. The one I was looking at, which is one of our major flagship newspapers, The Australian in Australia, they've actually been quite successful. They have a very hard paywall, so they're doing things like they're focusing on, you know, as I say, this building this loyal, engaged audience. But they think about one of the really important things is recency and frequency, so that people are coming regularly. And you know that they were there recently. So they're thinking very much about the journalism. It becomes very much journalism driven, which I think is one of the great byproducts of this shift in the business model, is it actually brings it back to a focus on quality and fulfilling the needs of the audience. So they are doing a lot of things like reaching out and opening channels for people to comment and having events and things like that, but they're also using, of course, like, you know, AI and other sort of technical solutions to making sure people are getting the kind of information that they would value. So they're thinking about if somebody likes this writer, who else might they like? And they're sort of mapping the you know, similarities between writers and the kind of content, so that they're actually surfacing the content that people need. So that's one of the things they think a lot about. The other one is newsletters is one of the great ways of actually building a relationship with your audience, and that's probably about all I've got time for, I think.
It's fine, yeah, that's okay. We'll go to this lady here.
Thanks. I'm Giovanna, I'm a fellow at Radio Free Europe. I wanted to ask you if you could explain us a little bit more about the fact-checking process, because when you're working with the communities, I think that's a possible issue, and how do you get around that? I mean, what are the precaution measures, and how do you actually approach people? Because I was working on a project in the Balkans, and then I just had a feeling when people give you stories that they're not necessarily, and especially when they're doing it voluntarily and so on, they kind of, I mean, there is this moment, and maybe that's just a regional thing, but that they feel that, you know, I gave you a story, and like, why are you bothering me with you know, like who my sources are, and just this and that, and so on and so on.
So again, depends a bit on the project, but a lot of our projects, for example, we have two types of projects actually, I think, where broadly, one is where people are sharing their own first-person lived experiences. So the dementia example, for example, they're not going out and reporting on other people, they're kind of sharing their own lived experience. Second type of project, where people are actually acting as community reporters, like the example I gave of covering the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone or the Nigerian elections, where, you know, we're sharing these stories with major international media outlets, and we have to make sure the facts are correct. So these projects always start off with a basic kind of training at the beginning, and actually we found that in terms of how to treat a source, how to verify things, the importance of the integrity of their story, that we could distill a lot of that journalistic 101 in like a sort of 2-day workshop or something at the beginning. And then that's also where the collaboration comes in, that we'll be working with journalists at our end who are experts in this more legal side and in fact-checking, and who also can triangulate with other community members in the same community to make sure that these reports are verified. So that's how we've worked with community groups, and the power of that. And Sierra Leone's a good example. Is actually that in 2012 we were covering the elections in Sierra Leone, one of our first ever projects, and we trained, went out for a reporting trip, but instead of doing the reporting ourselves, trained a group and left a SMS and audio reporting platform there. And then after that, it means after the elections, we had a sort of trained and trusted group there, and they carried on doing work, reporting on health and disability issues. Then the Ebola crisis hit in 2015, and they were there, and obviously international media was clamoring for kind of stories because they couldn't get in, and we made a series of documentaries with them at the end. Now they've been commissioned to do a big storytelling on malaria. So it just shows that if you are going to kind of make the effort to go to a country, to parachute in, then it's actually not that much extra effort to leave some skills and to leave a platform behind and to continue working with that community, in some cases for years to come.
Yeah. We have, what now, 3 minutes, I think. So we can answer one more question, I would say.
Jay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So hello, my name is Fanis, I'm from Greece. In my organization, we work also with refugees and migrants. We train them in journalism, photography, filmmaking, and they take part in our digital content. But from what I have seen in my experience, this requires time. This requires a slower pace of content production. And my question to you is, how do you deal with this when, as journalists, we are used to work in a very fast pace? So how do you deal in your daily operations with this slow pace of working?
I just have a question for you, actually. Whose pace do you want to slow down? The expectations that are placed on you, your pace?
So we train them, so they're not experienced to start producing content, and it requires much more time than a common journalist. Mm-hmm. So, for example, for a 500 words article, they maybe need 1.5 months or 2 months to write also in their mother language, translate it, you know.
I just have one point, and I think you're better qualified, but I think it's about this, the scale of the problem that you're introducing to them. If 500 words is a very big goal, how much can you break it down? I think going back to the game-based narrative, it's again the onboarding exercise that you're doing with them, so they understand, okay, I know the basic rules. Once I'm comfortable with that, then you gradually increase the scale.
Yeah, one thing we found when we have just a short period of time to work on a project is we've gathered people together, done a workshop to shape the narrative and things, and then gone about making kind of documentaries or other stories which are led and narrated by those communities, and worked with them throughout, which is a quicker and shorter way of completing stories. With this other approach of sort of seeding networks and training, what I say is that, I mean, I think if there was a breaking news story in Perugia tonight, which was going to be, it was a one-off weather event, and it wasn't going to be covered again, there's no point training a network and setting up a platform and stuff. The news outlets are going to go, they're going to cover it, and then that's it. But in terms of the cost benefit and that side of it, I think what's beneficial is to think about, are there projects or issues or themes which we're going to be covering, for example, for the next year or so? Because in that case, then if it's a story you're going to be returning to, and if you can predict that, then that's where you see that you may begin to save money. So the Ebola crisis went on for 2 years. So I didn't go out there once. We were getting stories throughout the crisis from this network, whereas some news teams, with all the insurance and other issues, were spending thousands and thousands to send a crew out at the beginning, got their stories, but then didn't get anything else afterwards. Same with dementia. We knew that we had outlets all around the UK who were interested in covering it because it's such a big issue now. So we knew that seeding a network would bring us enough stories to make it financially viable. So I think it's about also, it's definitely not, this approach doesn't work for all stories, and would be incredibly expensive in some cases, but also there are times to work out when it can be can be beneficial. And you're right that sometimes that, especially with the most marginalized groups, then that extra time to build trust and stuff, it is important because...
I think we have to wrap up now, but would any of you like to say one more final thing? Are we good for now?
I said lots.
Yeah. Thank you very much again for joining us. I hope you found that really useful with some things that you can apply to your own organisations, and do come up to any of us now to have a chat outside preferably, so they can move the next group in.